The Sukuna cycle is one of the biggest memes that has circulated in the Jujutsu Kaisen community, and with where the most recent chapter left off, I wouldn't be surprised if it started spreading again. For those unaware, the meme goes a little something like this. A challenger approaches, does something cool or noteworthy, piques Sukuna's interest, dies/gets knocked out, rinse and repeat. On the surface, it's hard to deny this pattern, but I just don't believe it's a good point against the series. And if anything, it's actively harmful to the overall discussions on Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, or even YouTube. Let me explain. The truth is, when you oversimplify something to this extent, you can make anything sound bad, or worse, boring. Take Frieren for example. A large portion of the episodes are one-offs where Frieren goes to a new location, does some good around the area in return for a grimoire, we flash back to Himmel the Goat, and then move on to the next town. If I boiled down 80% of the show to this, most of you would probably not find it interesting. But to anyone that has actually watched Frieren, you're already shaking your head in your seat because you know how wrong or stupid this sounds. While there may be a pattern, the actual stories within the episodes are what's interesting. Seeing how Frieren learns and grows throughout her journey as she recontextualizes her past experiences is the conflict and makes even the most mundane of episodes worth it. The final Sakuga Fest battles are great on their own, but they always follow a stream of character-driven stories that are equally or sometimes just more interesting. So how does this relate to the Sukuna cycle, and why do I think it's bad? I have 4 major points I want to go over. Oversimplification, the weekly slog, missing the forest of the trees, and the greater good. I already briefly touched on oversimplification, but in conclusion, any single piece of media or even real-life action, when oversimplified, can sound boring. The weekly slog. Jujutsu Kaisen is a weekly, ongoing series. This has its fair share of benefits, but also very obvious drawbacks. On one hand, getting a chapter a week is a great source of content that you can expect on a fairly consistent basis. You know what you're getting, and if you're locked in with the story, it becomes something to look forward to week to week. On the other hand, a week can be a fairly long time. Add to that magazine breaks or personal ones that the author takes, and suddenly you can go from 1 week to a couple or sometimes even a month without thinking about what you just read in the past few chapters, let alone throughout the course of this multi-year long story. Unless you're a nerd like me that's in a perpetual state of rereading the story, there's going to be things that you absolutely will miss out on. Take that bum Hikari for example. He's been fighting Rome for 6 real-life months, meanwhile Yuta packed up Kenjaku in only a handful of panels. The truth is, we just don't have a frame of reference for how much time has passed within the actual story, so we let our own perception guide us instead. This naturally leads to people making memes like these, despite Hikari's importance narratively both in his strength and purpose. But still, Shiesty Sorcerer on top. I'd also like to remind people that during Hikari vs Kashimo, a great number of fans were annoyed and bored with the fight, on account of it being repetitive and predictable. I wonder what that's reminding me of. Yet, of all the fights in the entire series, Hikari vs Kashimo ended up becoming a ubiquitous fan favorite once the dust had settled. My point in all this is to say that, yes, the week-to-week wait is annoying, but I think it would help to take a step back and not look at each chapter that comes out in a vacuum. Each chapter tends to build off of the previous, so my advice ends up being, whenever a new chapter comes out, just reread the previous 3 at least. See how they tie into this one, and I think it'll give you a better idea about Gege and their vision for the story. Now that we've taken a step back, here's what I think people are missing for the forest here. While the meme is pretty true, the nature of this gauntlet being cyclical, you should be taking a deeper look at the stories being told within the cycle. Let's just start from the top with the first one that even started this whole thing. Kashimo as a character is a little polarizing. He's seen as this hyped up monster that was going to match Sukuna and Gojo, the 3rd strongest in the verse even. Yet when he finally fights Sukuna in his Heian era form, he loses almost instantly. Why is that? I think an issue people have regarding Kashimo is that they'd overhyped him to a point where he never was really meant to be in Gege's eyes. In the actual story, all we get about Kashimo is that he wants to fight Sukuna, with a full extent of his one-time curse technique. Even in the flashback, the only reason he specifically is after Sukuna is because of what Kenjaku had told them. At no point after that is it implied or even stated that Kashimo has a level of power that can rival that of Sukuna's. Even his one-time curse technique was wanked by the community when there was no reason to go that far. Seriously, if I have to hear one more mouth breather tell me about how Kashimo can fire off gamma rays, I am going to lose it. Kashimo's fight against Sukuna ended quickly because of the narrative. Kashimo came into the fight and challenged Sukuna not just to truly test himself, but to get an answer to a question that he had been lamenting over for hundreds of years. Sukuna understood that and gave Kashimo what he wanted. In Kashimo's life, many had challenged him and all had failed. They didn't bear any resentment or hate when they fought him, they simply wanted acknowledgement, and Kashimo met them with a lightning bolt through their skulls. In Sukuna's eyes, that is love and the way for those that are truly strong to connect with those that are weaker. Kashimo simply was too greedy, and wanted both to bear the title of strongest while also being able to understand those beneath him. Sukuna simply put Kashimo in their shoes, ending his life swiftly at the hands of the strongest, finally freeing Kashimo from the curse that he had put upon himself. Whether Sukuna's answer is satisfying to you or not, Kashimo got his, and as a result concluded his character arc. Sure, it would have been nice to see him pop off against Heian-era Sukuna, but outside of Gojo, no one else has ever been put on that same pedestal, and Gege is hell-bent on sticking to it. What I find truly interesting, and why I really don't mind how quickly Kashimo was dispatched, is that Sukuna truly acknowledged his strength and didn't pull any punches. This net of dismantles is still the strongest attack barring strong cleave that we've seen Sukuna use on all of the combatants post-Gojo. Kashimo himself was never meant to be in their realm, and that's okay. It doesn't make him any less of an interesting character. Higuruma Hiromi is probably my favorite character introduced in the Culling games, and possibly a top 5 character period. I love his story, his dynamic with people both in his flashback as well as Yuji, and he arguably has one of the hardest double page spreads in the entire manga. Unfortunately, he also fell victim to the Sukuna cycle, and it's probably the least impactful one. At least when you look at what he took from Sukuna compared to some of the other characters in the gauntlet. This has led to people calling him useless, but once again, forest for the trees. Higuruma's character arc is concluded in this fight, and a new aspect and depth to Sukuna is added within this cycle. Higuruma is ashamed of himself. Once a man of the law who did things by the book and only wanted to help people, he was pushed to the brink and took matters into his own hands, killing the judge and prosecutor after unlocking his curse technique. And while we're led to believe that it was cathartic and just what they had deserved, by the end of his fight with Yuji, Higuruma outright tells us that it wasn't cathartic for him. Now that he's teamed up with Jujutsu High, he finally feels that he can right his wrongs. He didn't come into this fight just to altruistically save the world, he did it because of his own morals, and most importantly, because of Yuji. Feeling like he's the only one who should judge and punish himself, Higuruma jumps into an unwinnable battle and fights admirably, pulling out domain amplification and reverse curse technique in the 11th hour to survive the onslaught from the king, impressing even him with his raw, unbridled talent. Ultimately, it isn't enough and Higuruma is killed, but not before taking the curse tool Kamutoge with him, as well as finally looking Yuji in the eyes once more. We'll get to Kamutoge shortly, but the reason he looks Yuji in the eyes is actually important is because of the flashbacks we get throughout. During the time skip, all the fighters gathered and plotted how they were going to deal with Sukuna should Gojo lose. If you pay attention, you'll notice that Higuruma never looks Yuji directly in the eye in any of these panels, and Higuruma even says as much when it's just the two of them. He's ashamed for having strayed from his own morals, and it's only after he tries his best to atone by fighting and dying against Sukuna that he's able to meet Yuji's gaze. In the past, Higuruma had fought countless unwinnable cases because of his own morals and ethics. In the Calling games, he turned his back on the justice system and spiraled up until Yuji showed up and brought him back to his roots. Now that he's truly back, helping those that need it, he can look Yuji head on and entrust him with both his will and the Executioner's Blade. Kamutoge being taken away is definitely a kick in the balls to the readers. The tool itself puts some scratches and dirt in Kashimo and vaporizes a few of Meimei's crows. While the tool is strong and would undoubtedly pose a problem for Jujutsu High's forces, for a special grade curse tool, the on-screen feats are laughable, and don't really help in selling Higuruma's sacrifice as that big of a deal. While I love the conclusion of his character arc, I can't help but wish that Gege had either found a way to have Higuruma take more away from Sukuna, or at least point to Kamutoge being a much larger threat than it ended up being. Seriously, we have to do a lot of headcanon to make it stronger than it looked like, but that's just kind of cringe power scaling. But when you compare it to Trine, it's like Coughing Baby versus Hydrogen Bomb. Regardless, 2 cycles in and Gege has thrown into the pot 2 very compelling narratives, and it really doesn't stop there. Yuta and Yuji. I won't spend too much time on this one particularly because it was the biggest flat-out brawl out of all the other fights. There isn't really a clash of ideals or desire from Yuji and Yuta to learn or reach Sukuna, they just want him dead. Yuta blames himself for the state that they're in because he chose to satisfy his own desire to kill Kenjaku rather than what might have been the most logically sound plan. It's a good and interesting aspect to Yuta's character, but we don't really have enough time for that because we have to get into the single most brutal jumping in the entire manga. I don't think words are enough to explain Yuji's hatred for Sukuna, nor do I think they could ever do a better job than some of the sequences in this fight. From the way that Sukuna is attacked at all angles, the variety of techniques, the soul-seizing punches, and just the sheer vitriol felt in Yuji's eyes as he spits out blood at Sukuna after getting cleaved. This is a full-on brawl, and it is treated as such. While there isn't much on a narrative level, I do think this fight in the cycle is the strongest example of my 4th point, which we'll get to after talking about Maki. Maki is in an awkward place, both in the world of Jujutsu and within the fandom. The amount of people that were certain that she got knocked out by that Black Flash was astounding, and kind of infuriating. I don't know how many times Gege needs to spell out that she's one of the hard hitters and best bets against Sukuna, but here we are. Her part in the cycle falls more closely with Yuta and Yuji than with Higuruma and Kashimo, but her apparent joy in battle sets her apart from the rest, and her indirect clash of ideals against Sukuna is also interesting. While Gojo pushed Sukuna further than anyone in history, Maki is the first person to force a role upon Sukuna, one to prove that Jujutsu, the art that he has spent his entire life perfecting, is the true nature of sorcery. Maki exists outside of that boundary, and Sukuna becomes unhinged in an attempt to prove his point. I love this small interaction, and the fact that Maki isn't actually down for the count as she continues to defy Sukuna is what makes it all the more special. But with her out of the picture for the moment, that only leaves us with one man to take on Sukuna, that man being Kusakabe. Kusakabe is a quasi-joke character. Ever since his introduction, the one thing that has been clear as day is his dislike for conflict. Not because of some moral reason or because he isn't strong, but rather because Kusakabe simply does not want to risk his life and die a pointless death when he doesn't have to. He constantly finds ways to slack off and not fight, but when push comes to shove and those he holds close are in trouble, he is the first to act. His solo fight with Sukuna is very unlike him. From the very beginning, while his words toward Higuruma were about protecting him come out of his mouth, in his own head he wonders why he even said that. Now with no one else around, he throws himself at Sukuna, giving it his all. Despite knowing that he's nothing but an inconvenience to the king, he still continues to fight, fully expanding his simple domain to levels never before seen. His sword is broken, but he still isn't out of options. Feeling the spark of Sukuna's curse technique, he blinds him with his jacket before launching him, charging right behind Sukuna and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. He then envelops his broken sword in cursed energy, increasing his reach and aiming directly for Sukuna's heart. Why is he fighting so damn hard? Simple, it's because he's a kind man. Yaga had done a lot for him in the past, and as a way to repay not the debt, but the memory of a former friend who would have fought alongside him had things played out a little differently, Kusakabe charges into certain death, just how all the students had fairly done up until this point. He doesn't owe it to Yaga, he owes it to himself to protect those closest to him, and while the off-screening he gets is meant to be a little comedic, it's kinda fitting. Kusakabe was never going to seriously challenge Sukuna. Sukuna knew it, we knew it, and Kusakabe knew it better than everyone else. And that's what makes his solo chapter so captivating. Gege did a fantastic job at rounding out his character, and whether Kusakabe lives or dies, he served his role flawlessly, with Miwa taking over his mantle in the recent chapter. Miguel, Leroux, Ino, Wiwi, and Choso. I had the draft for this video written when Miguel showed up because the Sukuna cycle was at its peak, but the reason I held off on making the video then is because I wanted to at least see if Miguel or anyone else would break the cycle. And while none of these characters in particular break the cycle, they do contribute in ways that may go unseen. Conveniently, this brings me to my final point, the greater good. This fight is a gauntlet. Every single character that has fought Sukuna has played a minor to large role in his inevitable defeat. This can be hard to see on a week-to-week basis, so let's break down everyone's contribution so far. Gojo was by far the most important fighter. He lowered Sukuna's reserves to less than half, disabled his ability to use domain expansion for the majority of the fight, lowered Sukuna's reverse curse technique output to a fraction of what it used to be, forced Sukuna to permanently weaken his strong cleave, and brought his physical body to a state that Kashima could take advantage of, forcing out the one-time heal. Kashima was the one to force out the heal, a feat that looks unimpressive in a vacuum, but when you consider that Kashima was the only one with the resistance to Kametoke, it's hard to see how the Jujutsu High Gang would have forced out the heal without sustaining serious damage unless Yuta was there. Higuruma permanently took away Kametoke, a special great curse tool that Sukuna would have been able to spam and basically paralyze everyone there. Yuta did probably the most outward damage, cutting off one of his arms, heavily injuring a second, ripping out Tamikuna's tongue, and landing a max output Jacob's Ladder on top of his countless assists for Yuji in his soul-seizing attacks. Even after taking the brunt of either strong cleave or a strong dismantle, he is still able to set Maki up in the form of dropping his domain to convince Sukuna of his victory. Maki stabs his heart, permanently weakening him. With her sword striking directly at the soul, in Sukuna's current state the damage is nearly permanent, and any limb taken off with the sword becomes harder to heal. She also takes out another one of his arms, making it impossible for strong cleave to be cast. Kusakabe, Miguel, Leroux, Choso, and Ino. These five play purely supportive roles, with each of them helping out to varying degrees. Kusakabe does some damage to Sukuna in their fight, and buys time for Yuji to heal up with Choso. Miguel says Wiwi, arguably a top 3 most important characters in this entire fight, stalls Sukuna and lands a few heavy blows. Choso is just another body to throw at Sukuna, but he helps Yuji use piercing blood, and by hardening his own blood and using it as armor, stops Sukuna, allowing for Yuji to land another soul-seizing punch, thus helping cancel out the previous black flashes. And Leroux, to everyone's surprise, comes in clutch and sets up Yuji for his first black flash, putting him into the zone and indirectly helping him land the next 6. Ino follows a similar path, with him doing chip damage to Sukuna throughout, but his Ryu lets Yuji get into position for one more black flash, and the final cleaver to the face makes Yuji hit big number 7. On top of that, he gets a nice little moment with Gojo, Shoko, and Ichiji. Neat. And finally, the one true GOAT, Wiwi, for single-handedly carrying the team on his back both during the flashback and even in this fight. He is also the only one keeping the Gojo will come back copium alive, truly a generational performance. Yuji, on the other hand, is the key to defeating Sukuna. His attacks are the only ones that actively weaken him, and if not for Yuji and his ability to constantly weaken Sukuna, this would not be a winnable fight, especially after Sukuna landed his black flashes. And with Yuji awakening Shrine, I can see him continuing to pull through as he gets more and more accustomed to the technique. The reason I have this section here is because people genuinely believe that Gege has written himself into a corner by making Sukuna too powerful, and that the only way this ends is with some kind of Aspel. But time and time again, Gege has shown how consistent they are with their power system, and Sukuna's downfall is one that will not only be logical, but one that will happen with everyone playing their part, big or small. The Sukuna cycle as a meme has convinced a large portion of the fanbase that nothing is actually happening, and I just don't think that's the case when you take a slightly deeper look, both at a narrative level and also just a visual one.